Good evening. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Lougheed College Lectures. My name is Rhonda Breitkreitz. I'm a professor in the Department of Human Ecology and a faculty member at the Peter Lougheed Leadership College, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Tonight, we're honored to have Jana Pruden come and speak with us in her talk entitled The Misery Beat, The Ethics of Reporting on Crime and Human Suffering. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis peoples. The Lougheed College Lecture Series is in its 4th year. The purpose of this lecture series is to expose our students to provocative ideas that will challenge their thinking. This lecture series is part of a course offered by the Peter Lougheed Leadership College, but also open to the university community and the broader public. So thank you for coming today and making this event a success. I would just like to ask, how many people have been to the lecture before offered by the Peter Lougheed Leadership College? Great, all the students, good to know. Good, and some others, great. And how many of you are here for the first time? Great, well, welcome to all of you. Thank you very much again for coming. At the Lougheed College, we are building a unique high-quality leadership program for undergraduate and, as of next year, graduate students. It's unique because it's available to any student from any discipline on campus. And we think that the diversity of our student body is the key strength of the college, because students get together in small forum groups and work together to wrestle over tough leadership issues. And so we're very honored to have students from a great range of backgrounds in our program. I would like to acknowledge a few people that make this lecture series possible for us. First of all, we have our principal, Dr. Lois Harder. We have Syncrude, who sponsors this event and makes this lecture series possible for us. We have a number of volunteers who come and dedicate their time to keep the wheels turning for this event. So thank you to the volunteers. We have Brandon Garib, who I don't know where he is. He's running around somewhere, but he does all the logistics for this event. And so we're very grateful to Brandon for the work that he does. And we have our tech team, Angus Finley and Larry Grosfield, who provide excellent tech support for us. And so we thank you both as well. We also have a group of teaching fellows that are working with our first-year students at the college, who are talented and dedicated and very committed to offering the students a high-quality experience. And we couldn't do this program without them, so I'd just like to name them as well. We have Benjamin Denga, Ziana Esmail, Rob Jackson, Yashi Parmar, Mary Pinkowski, and James White. So thank you to all of you. And finally, we have our Lougheed Scholars, the students that are involved in this program. We wouldn't be able to do it without you. So let's give a hand to all of these people that help make this a success. I just have a few announcements and logistics that I'd like to mention. Our next lecture, which will be the final lecture for this season, is on April 4th. It's being offered by Elvin Law, and it's called What's Your Label? We also have a campus food bank that comes to our lecture series. We invite you to bring an item for the food bank or to donate online. Either would be very much appreciated. For tonight, this lecture will run until 6:45. It will start with the lecture and end with a Q&A. At 6:45, we'll say goodnight to you, and all of the students will reconvene for the second half of the class. Tonight, we ask that you do not take any audio or video recordings and that you turn off your cell phones. I would now like to invite Yashi Parmar to come up. She is one of our teaching fellows, and she is going to introduce tonight's speaker. Yashi.
Hello. So, Jana Pruden is an award-winning feature writer at the Globe and Mail based in Edmonton and the former Crime Bureau Chief of the Edmonton Journal. In her 20 years as a reporter, she has written for newspapers and magazines around the country, covering some of Canada's biggest criminal cases and breaking news events. She has co-authored 2 books of true crime, and in addition to the Globe and Mail, her work has appeared in The Walrus, Reader's Digest, and Long Reads. And she is the founder of the Flatworms Writing Studio and the Bad Girls Movie Club, and is a sessional instructor at MacEwan University. So please join me in welcoming Jana Pruden.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and also to the Peter Lougheed Leadership College for hosting this event. It's really an amazing opportunity for me to be able to talk about the ethics of crime reporting, which is something I'm extremely passionate about, and I'm so glad to see that there's other people interested in this as well. As Rhonda said, I'm going to speak for a bit, and then we should have time for some questions. So please think of questions so we won't all be standing here awkwardly. I'm a reporter, so I'm going to start with a story. And since I'm a crime reporter, it's going to be a bad one. Sorry for that, but I assume you folks probably knew what you were getting into when you came here this evening. So many years ago in Regina, a man named Darren Philpott died suddenly in jail of an apparent suicide. I was the court reporter at the Regina Leader-Post at the time, and I'd been covering Darren's case, and I was watching it extremely closely. Darren had been an active member of his church and a volunteer in the community, a coach, a very popular person who was particularly known for his work with young boys. The community was devastated when Darren was charged with numerous child pornography and child sexual abuse allegations. But none of the evidence had been heard publicly because the charges were still before the court, and many people were standing by Darren. That makes sense. They truly loved and trusted him so much. But I had heard some of the evidence at a bail hearing and through talking to police sources, and I knew how strong the case against him was. I also knew that he was about to plead guilty and get a life sentence. This was a really important case because it was expected to set a new sentencing precedent across Canada. It was also important because Darren had been cooperating with authorities and had given them access to accounts that were linked to child abuse and child pornography rings around the world, and he had agreed to work further with police. And then he was dead, found hanging in the shower of the secure segregation wing at the Regina jail, where he'd been left alone for at least half an hour with a chair and a bed sheet, though he was on suicide watch and supposed to be monitored constantly. There were a lot of things that bothered me about this, including that someone on suicide watch who had recently attempted suicide was left alone on a secure ward in a shower for a very long period of time with a chair and a bed sheet, despite the fact that a police investigator had already met with the warden, pleading with him to keep Darren alive until court. There's a lot we could get into there, too. But it also bothered me because I knew Darren had committed truly, truly horrendous offenses against children, and that now that case was over, as dead as he was. A few days later, I went to his funeral. I wasn't covering it, I just wanted to see. And I stood there quietly watching. And there I saw people who knew Darren talk about how wonderful he was, how caring, how godly. I remember one woman imagining how they were going to have a big picnic together one day in heaven. And there was a couple of vague allusions to him facing some trouble, but the gist was that that was between him and God, and that they were just allegations, and that people are innocent until proven guilty. And of course, people are innocent until proven guilty. But I also knew that in this case, they were not just allegations. I knew there were boys who had disclosed horrific abuse at the hands of this extremely manipulative man, and that there were photographs and videos and forensic evidence and emails and web chats and a confession that proved his guilt beyond any doubt. But the people who knew and loved and trusted Darren, the people who had entrusted their children to Darren, would never know that. He and his victims were part of a very close-knit community, and it was clear to me that the community believed this beloved man more than these kids, some of who came from somewhat troubled families and backgrounds. In those days, I went to the courthouse in Regina every day, and I knew the guards there quite well. And so one day after court, I was kind of hanging around, and I mentioned that I was thinking about writing about Darren, and that I was going to contact the mother of one of his victims to see if she would speak with me. They all told me that I shouldn't. She's been through enough, one of them told me. Why would you want to cause her more pain and open this all up? Just leave it alone. Now, this was 10 years ago, and I was really just starting to get into crime reporting, and I really struggled with what to do. Why would I want to cause her more pain? Maybe I should just leave it alone. It took me a long time to decide which story to start this speech with, because there are so many stories just like this. In fact, reporting on crime, these kinds of questions and decisions come up almost every single day, in every single story, though in new ways, with new circumstances, new people, new decisions, new dilemmas. Does simply contacting the family of a victim of a horrific crime cause more pain? Does knocking on the door of a family's home invade their privacy? What makes a photo too graphic to run? What kinds of details are too much to be included in sexual assault cases? Should we name mass killers? Should we name homicide victims? Should we share graphic video already circulating on social media? What if a victim had a very serious criminal record? What do we do with that information? Is it part of the story? What are the considerations of privacy, security, safety we owe to our subjects? And what do we owe to our readers and audiences? The questions go on. How do you deal with someone who may or may not be a murderer? What if you find a piece of evidence at a crime scene? What if an accused killer comes to think of you as a friend? What if a dying subject tells you they love you? These are all real questions. These are all decisions that I personally have faced. They matter to me because it's my work, it's my vocation, and they're things that reporters and editors at reliable news organizations grapple with extremely seriously every single day. But that doesn't mean the rest of you are off the hook. There are questions for the consumers of true crime coverage as well, particularly coverage that goes beyond a daily news story into some of the extremely sophisticated and engaging written features and TV shows and podcasts and books we're seeing right now. What does it mean to really love a true crime show on Netflix? To be hooked on a true crime podcast? To really appreciate the way a crime story is told? Are we hurting families just by consuming these stories? Are we using the pain of others for our own entertainment? As you may suspect, the answers are extremely complicated. Good thing we're here for an hour. And you don't have plans later, right? Because I'm just going to keep you here all night. So at present, we're in the midst of what some are calling a true crime boom. And there's definitely been a resurgence in true crime writing and long-form journalism, and of course, the popularity of true crime podcasts like Serial and S-Town and In the Dark, documentaries like Making a Murderer and The Staircase and The Jinx. Most recently, there's a new Ted Bundy documentary that has been criticized in part for being so stylish and seductive. In recent days, I've seen a lot of people talking about the Michael Jackson documentary, Leaving Neverland, and I think we're going to be hearing more about that in the days to come. But while true crime might certainly be enjoying a bit of a moment, this is not the first time people have been engaged by true stories of crime and misery. And I think it's helpful to think about this, particularly in recognizing that a resurgence in this genre is not some sign of new societal breakdown or decay. We may actually be in societal breakdown and decay, but an interest in true crime is not the proof of that. In fact, true crime has been around about as long as humans have. There are cave paintings dating back more than 30,000 years that show people pierced with arrows. These paintings are notable not only because they show that this violence occurred, but also that even our most ancient ancestors had a desire to record it. Zooming ahead a few dozen thousand years, since we only do have an hour, we come to the popular crime sheets of the 18th and 19th century in England, which were illustrated and descriptive depictions of crime and criminals, which were usually sold to spectators alongside the public executions of their subjects. If you start to think binge watching a murder documentary on Netflix seems grim, remember that we actually used to go and watch executions and then buy illustrated souvenirs to take home. As literacy rates increased and newspapers made information broadly accessible in the early 20th century, crime stories proved to be a constant source of public fascination. During some sensational trials, newspapers put out extra editions all day long, updating readers on every single development in the case, while people at times literally fought for copies fresh off the presses to hear the latest developments. I've read reports of people hanging out of courthouse windows as they watched proceedings, the original form of binge watching. One such case was the sensational Snyder Gray trial in 1928. It was a hugely sensational trial in which a woman and her lover were tried for the murder of her husband. It had everything: a scandalous affair, a seductress, a hapless husband, and the dangerous temptations of jazz. People could not get enough. And I mention this case in particular because it went on to inspire countless films and other cultural creations. Writer James M. Cain was among those who watched the trial every single day, and that trial became the inspiration for his book and then the film Double Indemnity, which played a role in the development of the whole genre of film noir and The Black Widow. But I digress. Flora Belle Muir, who was one of the few female crime reporters working in the late 1920s, compared getting through the courthouse during the Snyder Gray trial as being, quote, like pushing one's way through a stampede of Texas longhorns, with hundreds of members of the public shoving their way towards the third floor courtroom to get a first-hand glimpse of these murderous lovers. Flora Belle described the stairwell and hallways of the courthouse littered with hats and eyeglasses and fur collars, shoes, even girdles that had been somehow torn off their wearers in the crush and discarded in the courthouse halls. It was a point of fascination that there were always more people at court in the afternoon, and this was because housewives had gotten their children off to school and had gotten all their chores done and could go to court to see the drama for themselves. Covering the case as a correspondent for the Universal Service, storied reporter Damon Runyon noticed with some concern that women seemed particularly interested in the more gruesome evidence. He described seeing a group of women pushing and shoving to get a closer look at the victim's blood-stained pillow, which sat on the district attorney's table as a piece of evidence. That scene in the court was one that should give the philosophers and psychologists pause, he later wrote. The women were far more interested in the bloody pillow than they would have been in a baby buggy or a dishpan full of dirty dishes. And while I think Damon Runyon may have been overestimating the intrigue of a dishpan full of dirty dishes, he was also noticing and wondering about some of the very same things that we are thinking about today. And interestingly, some of the recent stories I've seen about this so-called true crime boom specifically question why the genre appears to hold particular appeal to women. I also note that Damon Runyon, who referred to Ruth Snyder in one story as, quote, a black-garbed, white-faced, tawny-haired leopardess of a woman, was obviously a bit taken with the case himself. And I don't recall reading any big Runyon features about baby buggies or dirty dishes. The popularity of true crime grew further with the development of crime comics, including publications like Crime Does Not Pay, Famous Crime, and True Crime, which depicted true stories of criminals and their crimes in the popular and engaging new visual comic book format. There was so much interest in crime comics, and that interest was seen as so dangerous that by the late 1940s, there was a major movement opposing them. In some cases, true crime comics were burned in pyres. In 1948, John Mason Brown, a writer and theater critic at the Saturday Review of Literature, described crime comics as the marijuana of the nursery, the bane of the bassinet, the horror of the house, the curse of kids, and a threat to the future. There were similar concerns closer to home as well. British Columbia MP Davy Fulton led a successful campaign to make crime comics illegal in Canada, and crime comics were outlawed in 1949, and that law remained in effect until December of last year, December 2018. In the 1960s and 70s, seminal true crime books like Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, Joseph Wambaugh's The Onion Field, and Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song topped bestseller lists and raised similar questions about this tension of being engaged by true crime. How are we supposed to feel about a beautiful piece of writing about a real and ugly act? Is it wrong to enjoy it? I mention all of this to say that it is not a new thing that we are drawn to true crime stories, and it is also not new that we are simultaneously disturbed and unsettled by our own interest in them. I've been focusing on crime stories for about the past 16 years as a court reporter at the Regina Leader-Post, then moving on to a position as the crime bureau chief at the Edmonton Journal, and now as a feature writer with the Globe and Mail. In that time, I've thought a lot about how media organizations cover crime, or the misery beat, as it was historically known, and also how different editors treat this subject. I found that many people, including some editors, think crime stories are by their very nature morbid and unseemly, and that people only want to read them because of some sort of prurient fascination or bloodlust, the same way we might watch horror movies. Think of that time-honored newspaper adage, if it bleeds, it leads. This saying has always bothered me, as I believe it reflects a serious misunderstanding of why people are drawn to true crime stories. That saying implies that people only read a story that bleeds because of an enjoyment of other people's pain. In this way of thinking, a crime story gets attention from the press and from the public, not because it's important or profound or relevant to society and the lives of others, but simply because it's gory. And if you thought that, I can see why you would hold crime reporting and the whole true crime genre in very low regard. But after 20 years as a reporter, I can tell you with certainty that that is not the case. And I know this because I talk to cab drivers and dentists and people at grocery stores and dinner parties about the stories that I have covered. I get phone calls and letters and tweets and Facebook messages from the readers of these stories. Sometimes people tell me that a story moved them so deeply it made them cry. Sometimes they say a story changed them. Sometimes they ask how they can help the victims. Sometimes a story spurs people into action, pushing to change law, to raise awareness, or to do whatever they can in hope that whatever happened to the people in that story will never happen again to anybody else. These are not the reactions of people who are simply reveling in the gory details of someone else's misfortune. Instead, I think people are interested in true crime stories for maybe the most shocking reason of all, because we care and because these stories matter. Human beings want to know about other human beings. We want to know what other people do, how they live, what happens to them. This is a very deeply rooted part of our nature, a truly fundamental aspect of how we operate in the world. And in many cases, maybe even in most cases, we learn these things through stories. This desire to watch and learn about each other is why there are books and TV shows and movies at all, why we read comics and magazines and newspapers, why we look at pictures on Instagram, why we follow threads on Twitter, why we read Facebook posts. In fact, stories are so powerful that we may read or watch or hear a story about someone we've never met, someone from a different time, from around the world, who has nothing to do with us, and yet that story can be so powerful, it can stick with us for the whole rest of our lives. That is the case with all stories, but I believe it is particularly so with stories that are true. And we want to share stories about ourselves, too. That's why we tell our families and friends and coworkers something funny or difficult or strange that happened on the weekend. That's why we, too, tell anecdotes and write Twitter threads and Facebook posts. Why, when something happens to us, whether very good or very bad, our first instinct is often to tell someone. And when we cannot tell an important story, being unable to share it can in fact become a burden. We are all sharing stories about what it means to be human, from those cave paintings right on down to now, with me standing on this stage. And crime stories are a huge part of that. That's because crime stories are about some of the most extreme and profound aspects of human experience. They are stories about what it means to kill another person, about what it means for someone to be killed, about what it means to lose everything, about what it means to survive such loss, about what can come out of such ugliness and the things that can happen after, about whether there can truly be justice or redemption or closure. Stories, quite literally, of life and death, good and bad, and everything in between. And I think this is why we're drawn to them. Maybe we're even particularly programmed to be interested in these kinds of stories because they can help us make sense of the world and its dangers and serve as both lessons and warnings. When a crime or tragedy happens, we want to know what happened, why it happened, whether it could have been prevented, what its effects are. It's also sometimes a time for us to reflect on what it would have been like if that horrible thing had happened to us or to our families, or how we could avoid it and keep ourselves and our own families safe from a similar fate. In some cases, and I think of an example like the Humboldt bus crash, it can even be a time to wonder what it would be like if we ourselves were to be responsible for such a horrible thing. And while individual stories, of course, matter, broader social issues such as domestic violence, mental health, drug addiction, racism, sexual violence, and poverty are also often deeply woven into criminal acts. We can look at and understand huge and vitally important issues in new ways, in part through recording and reporting on individual cases, through the real stories of real people. Crime stories are also about accountability, to question the systems and the people that govern us. There is an old adage that justice is not done unless it can be seen to be done, and the media has a significant role in that. We are the eyes of the public. Done properly, crime reporting can be profound and powerful. It can be a way to give a voice to the voiceless or to help someone find their voice. It can do what all good journalism should, tell interesting, important stories that matter. What H.L. Mencken and many others have actually said is journalism's duty, to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And the true cost of crime and violence cannot be fully understood without knowing about the lives it touches. Excuse me. Crime reporting is not always easy, and it is not always comfortable, but that's the nature of tragedy. So let's go back to that story I started with, the mother whose child was abused by a trusted friend, a respected member of her church. I can tell you I thought hard before I approached her. The thought of causing more pain to a family who had already been through so much was pretty ugly. Those calls aren't fun to make, so if you can possibly convince yourself out of it, it's pretty tempting. But in the end, I called her. And when I called her, the very first thing she said was, "Thank you for calling me." She wanted to talk, and she had a lot to say. Those conversations became the foundation of a 6-part series exposing Darren Philpott as a dangerous pedophile and questioning the people and organizations who had enabled and supported him, who allowed a vicious predator to operate in their midst despite many red flags. Those stories put on the record very clearly that these were not just unfounded allegations, and that Darren's death had allowed him to escape the consequences. I believe, and still do, that exposing Darren and telling the stories of his victims was extremely important, not only to give voice to their experiences, but to put the information out there for victims of him and other predators who are not yet identified or known. There were also a lot of very serious lessons for parents and organizations and individuals to learn about how to protect children from these kinds of predators in the future. It's very easy to look away from something so disturbing, and I wanted the people who knew Darren to know the reality of what he did and what he was, to grapple with that and to hopefully learn from it too. Because if you doubt that someone has been an offender, you also doubt that someone else has been a victim. If you don't face that someone was a predator, you don't admit that there are children that he hurt. In the years since, I've learned that many people believe that the simple act of calling a victim's family causes more pain. And this may in fact be true. Bob Steele, a media ethics expert at the Poynter Institute, has said that he believes asking victims to speak will always have some negative impact, especially if it's quite soon after a traumatic event. But he also says that the potential benefits outweigh the damage, both for the victim and for the public. I have learned you can't assume how a victim or their family will react, and that everyone should have a chance to tell their story if they choose to. I believe everyone should have the chance to make their loved one more than a name or a statistic. When I talk to victims groups, as I do occasionally, one of the things I tell them is that in a process where you have so little power, deciding when and how to share your story is one thing you can control. That is up to you, and there's a lot of power in that. In many cases, I approach people at what may be one of the most traumatic and difficult moments of their entire lives. It's hard to explain what that kind of pain sounds like when it is so fresh, sometimes within an hour. It's visceral, it's gutting. I try to be gentle but direct. I don't trick people. I try to imagine what it would be like if I was the one on the other end of that phone call. Sometimes people tell me to get lost, not usually in those exact words. I've been sworn at, yelled at, intimidated, spit at, threatened with arrest and assault. I have had a woman with her face this far from me threaten to stab me, but I understand. People in these situations are obviously very upset and angry, and I would probably react in a similar fashion to a reporter in that circumstance too. But that doesn't mean the story's over. The woman who said she was going to stab me didn't, thankfully. And in fact, she did speak to me for hours. And by the end of our conversation, she hugged me. A few years ago, I started contacting a woman named Holly Crichton, asking if she would talk to me. Her husband, Sandy, had been killed by their son, shot in the back of the head in the doorway of a building on their farm. At that point, almost no information had been released publicly about this, but I'd seen some court documents, and I knew that the reality of what was happening on that farm was a lot different from the way it seemed. When I first contacted Holly, she told me she didn't want to speak. She said she wanted to leave it alone and move on with her life. She didn't want to open up what had happened again. But there was something that really bothered me about the idea that her son would always look like a murderer and that people wouldn't know the truth of what happened. Holly and I went back and forth for about 2 years before I finally convinced her to speak with me, and I flew up to Grand Prairie to meet her. That story, Fear on the Family Farm, became one of the most successful stories I've ever written, and it was read and shared around the world. It ran in 2013, and I still get letters from people about it with some regularity. After the story came out, Holly started working on a memoir of her own, and in 2016, I went to Grand Prairie to host her book launch. That was an incredibly beautiful night. The abuse that Holly and her sons had suffered at the hands of her husband is out in the open now. And we know that her son, Matt, is not a murderer, but a victim. It's hard to quantify how much this story about domestic violence has moved people, connected with people, helped people, but I know it has. And I know that sharing it helped Holly too. There's not always such a happy ending, but that's all right. This is real life, after all. Last week, I happened to catch Joe Berlinger being interviewed by Tom Power on CBC. And Joe Berlinger was talking about his controversial new documentary, The Bundy Tapes, and the true crime genre more broadly, and this idea of making entertainment out of other people's tragedies. Joe Berlinger has been making true crime documentaries for about 25 years. His 1996 documentary, Paradise Lost, The Child Murders at Robin Hill, remains, in my opinion, one of the best true crime documentaries ever made. I saw it in theater long before I thought of becoming a reporter, and it's the first true crime work I really remember. The first time I really noticed how beautiful and moving and important a story about something so terrible could be. Though Berlinger has said he set out to make a movie about a group of teens who committed these horrible, senseless murders, he instead exposed the wrongful conviction of 3 young men, one of whom had been sentenced to death for a horrific crime. And the documentary ultimately played a huge role in those young men gaining their freedom. Damien Eccles has said he believes he would have been executed if it were not for that documentary. These stories matter. In the interview on Q last week, Joe Berlinger said, quote, "That phrase true crime somehow conjures up an image of wallowing in other people's misery for the sake of the entertainment of others, and I'm very sensitive to that criticism. There are certainly works in this category that fulfill that. My answer to how to honor the victims is to tell a responsible story." As Berlinger notes, not all true crime is created equal, and I'm sure we could all bring to mind a dime store paperback with a cover drenched in inked blood spatters and some salacious title. I particularly remember these books from the 1980s. But a new interest in true crime stories is a chance to do better, to show the power of these stories and this genre, and even to move past the stigma of it. In many ways, our responsibilities as reporters of true crime are no different than our responsibilities in any other kind of journalism. We must be fair, accurate, clear-eyed, accountable. We must also bring absolute seriousness to the reporting. A simple mistake, like getting one letter wrong in a victim's name, can be truly devastating to a grieving family. We need to think about how we deal with victims, families, and accused people, though we cannot become fixated on not causing pain. That is not our only consideration or obligation. Sometimes a family may not want the story of a murder in the media at all. That's not possible. Murder is not a private matter. Sometimes it will hurt to get the phone call, but we need to pick up the phone regardless. We need to think carefully both about our reporting and our writing, our presentation, our pictures, our headlines. In a long feature of mine that ran last fall called After the Fire, my editors and I discussed many aspects of the storytelling at length, debating, in some cases, a single word, the inclusion of a single moment. We had an entire meeting debating whether to run a graphic photograph of a dead dog. One argument was that the photo showed the true brutality of the crime and was important to express the reality of what occurred. The other side of the argument was that that photo was unnecessary, too much, too sensational, even that people would be so disturbed by that photo that they would stop reading the story. Is there a right answer? I'm not sure, but I think we all need to have these conversations. I don't sleep much before a big story comes out. Though I've usually read it and checked it a million times, I go over and over the story in my head, worrying I've made a mistake, thinking about how the family and those connected to the case will respond, wondering if I could have done something different or better, wondering if all those choices we made were the right choices, the ethical choices. When After the Fire came out, I got a letter from a close member of the victim's family. She and her family had declined to speak with me all the way through the process, and I really had no idea how she was going to react to the story. I admit it was extremely difficult to read, she wrote me. Needless to say, it brought everything to the surface yet again, but truthfully, it's never far away from my thoughts. And then she said, "Thank you." We fail sometimes. Of course we do. Not all families are the same, nor all victims. These are complicated questions. Difficult choices are often made with very quick deadlines, and sometimes no real or right answer, no right or wrong answer. And as our culture changes, so does our work evolve. We have to constantly consider why we do what we do and how we do it. We need to be thoughtful to evaluate and reevaluate the choices we're making, to consider our intention in what and how we present something, to be able to explain and stand by the work that we do. And as consumers of true crime, our obligations aren't actually much different. We can speak with our time and our attention to the work that we believe in, to work that questions, that elevates, that teaches, that amplifies, that gives voice. Those choices support the creation of more good and ethical work. Instead of abandoning true crime stories or fighting our interest in them, we should be holding them to the highest possible standards, ensuring that reporting of true crime is responsible and accurate and thoughtful and fair, just as journalism should always be. And most importantly, we all need to remember that these are real stories about real people. These are true crimes, and that is exactly why they matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana, for that thoughtful lecture. I'd now like to open up the lecture to some questions. We have a little time for questions. If you could just keep your questions as brief as possible so that we can get as many questions as possible, that would be much appreciated. I have a mic here that it's very soft and light, and we have Ziana and James here who are going to pass it around or throw it, so feel free to catch it. So, thank you. Turn it over to you. There's one over there. I don't know if she wants to throw that far.
No, I don't. I can come to you. All right, this I can do. That's amazing. Is this right? Oh, there it is. As consumers of true crime stories, are there any markers that we should look for ethical reporting versus unethical reporting? Like the Ted Bundy, I know, was an example you just gave, but what would be specific things that we could look for to make ethical choices?
That's a very good question. I think often instinctively when you start to see a piece and you see the format and presentation of it, you can sometimes tell if something is sort of a tabloid crime treatment versus a really in-depth look at the crime story. I really believe in getting to know certain bylines, certain journalists, following journalists that you trust and seeing people that they recommend. And sometimes if you're watching something and you're not sure, then read up about it, think about it yourself. I think, to me, the big difference that I often see is this between something that obviously is crafted and beautiful and that people have done their best to tell what are sometimes extremely complex stories and make sense of a lot of different perspectives versus, Mummy Don't, the true story of an axe-wielding psychopathic mother, that even just by instinct we can tell. I think that's going to be really sensational. Who knows if the facts are actually going to be accurate. And I think that's what I would say. Thank you.
Questions?
Any more questions?
One over here.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I'm just wondering what your opinion of catharsis theory is in terms of, we watch true crime and we listen to true crime and, we study true crime as a means of coming to terms with our own mortality. Just wondering what your opinion of that is.
Yeah, I think that's probably, I've never studied catharsis theory, but the way that you sum it up really makes a lot of sense to me, that we're figuring out what other people can survive and how they can survive it. And I think sometimes that's why we're particularly interested in stories of horrible people that don't look like horrible people, because our brains are trying to make sense of, what happens if you can't see it? What if someone looks like Ted Bundy or Bruce MacArthur, and we know them and they're really nice people, but they're also capable of this, and how do we navigate that? So I think looking for ways that we can navigate in our own lives, and then sometimes, yes, I think, so the Crichton story that I mentioned would be a really good example of that. so many people who reached out to me were people who had lived with incredible domestic abuse in their own lives, in many cases had never told anyone, and were bearing these incredible secrets. And to see Matt and Holly's story shared was a way that they could sort of validated their own experience, even though, you know, maybe they didn't know them, maybe they lived around the world, and still they found something so strong to connect with in that story. And I think that really happens a lot, actually, that we see ourselves in people and in stories, and sometimes that alleviates a bit of our own burdens. At her book launch, you know, it was really interesting to just stand there and watch as person after person came up to her with tears in their eyes, and so many of them, I know, were sharing their own experience with her. And yeah, absolutely. So apparently I do believe in catharsis theory, though I had never heard about it until now. So great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello.
Hi.
So when you're talking about true crime and its effect in terms of trying to judge its merit on sharing a story versus being too tabloidy, I was thinking of Abducted in Plain Sight, the Netflix. I don't know if you've seen it. Essentially, it's about a woman who's been kidnapped twice over a period of her life, and her family was very seduced by this person who had kidnapped their child. And so the reason why I mention is because that documentary had exploded online, and people started making fun of the father who had been sexually involved with the man as well as the mother. And so my question is, are there any examples of journalism that's this kind of mixed bag, where you see some value in it in terms of sharing, okay, maybe these are things we learned, but also had that tabloid feel or that feeling of, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, that was a really terrible thing. I should learn how to speak.
I definitely think better with things that are written, so I will give you an equally convoluted answer, I'm sure. I think it's probably always a mixed bag. I mean, could we ever see, even in the best possible works, the works that I think are truly great, works of art, so important, would there be no moment where I would wonder, like, that moment seems a bit weird, or should they have done that, or shouldn't they have done that? I'm not sure you could ever have a perfect piece. And I think thinking about that in yourself and interrogating that in yourself is actually really important as we really start to think about why are we drawn to these stories, and what do we want to see in them, and what do we expect of the filmmaker. I haven't seen that particular one yet, although I see a lot of people on my Facebook and Twitter in all caps feeling very frustrated about some of the decisions in that particular piece. You know, I personally recently watched Wild Wild Country, which I found extremely interesting and extremely thought-provoking, and had some real problems with too in other parts. So I think that's really all part of us figuring out what we want to take from a piece and what we hope to see from the people that are making this work. And probably no piece is perfect. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes? Oh.
I think she was directing if I did the question. My question
Yeah.
to you is, considering that newsrooms are thinning out, it's my understanding that you have less and less human. Considering that newsrooms are thinning out, it's my understanding you have less and less kind of human resource support in these rooms. How do you, as a journalist or a journalist in true crime, identify, one, the story that you choose to focus on and run, and two, dedicate the necessary resources to ensure that that piece is hitting the ethical, moral, and responsible aspects of publishing?
Yes. So I think, you know, all of us are drawn to different stories for different reasons. I personally have a list on my desk of about 30 stories and cases that I'd like to write about at any given time. Sometimes there are very practical reasons for choosing one over the other, because a trial is taking place, or someone has agreed to talk to me, or an anniversary is coming up. Sometimes other cases that I'd really like to write about, I just can't find the people yet. I just can't get my foot in the door. I think choosing what case to write about is a conversation that happens with editors, no matter how many resources you have, and that as a reporter, hopefully you bring, passion to a story that you care about. It's harder to do this work when you have very small amounts of time, but I always look to the past. And in the history of journalism, there was a lot of really quick turnaround of really amazing work too. So I think if you care about something, you just have to find a way to do it. And I certainly haven't written probably any of the big stories of my career in 9 to 5, and I sometimes wrote them with extremely short amounts of time. But if the stories are worth telling, that's worth doing. I happened to watch a documentary called Deadline Artists this week about Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill, two Deadline reporters in New York, very famous. Jimmy Breslin, a couple of his pieces, including a piece that he wrote about the grave digger who dug John F. Kennedy's grave. It's called Deadline Artist because he wrote it on deadline, and that stands today as a truly beautiful work of art, a truly important piece of journalism. So I think, we're figuring out what this new media environment is going to look like. And though we have less of some things, we also have more of other things, including the internet and digitized archives. Even in the olden days when I started reporting, sometimes you had to go through microfilm. Now there's great archives like newspapers.com that has PDFs of papers that go back to the 1800s. I can start to research a case completely digitally. I don't have to spend 4 days at the archives. And so, things change. We lose some things. We gain some things, too. Yeah.
Jana, there's a question in the front here that we've been waiting for a
Hello?
while.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this amazing story. My question is, obviously, when you're hearing the stories of the victims and the families, that must take an emotional toll on you. I'm wondering, how do you take care of your mental health? And do you find that, can you lead the victims of these families to resources, within Alberta or wherever in Canada? And do you think that every family has equal access to these kind of resources?
Right, so I think there's a few things to unpack there. Definitely not everyone has the same access to resources, and that is an issue. The story that I told you about the victim of this sex offender would be an example of a family and a child that was left without resources or counseling that was very badly needed. I do not specifically direct people to resources. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a counselor. And I think it's pretty important to be clear about what our roles are in this relationship. I am a reporter, and when you're telling me things, even if it may feel good to open up, I'm listening because it's going to become part of a work of journalism. If there happens to be a resource that I'm aware of, so for instance, the Victims of Homicide Support Group, which I think is a really amazing group that operates in Edmonton, and I've had some contact with them through the years. So in some cases, I might say to someone, have you ever heard of this group, or have you gone to this group, sort of, just if it happens to come up. But I don't, in Canada, if you are the victim of a crime or your family is the victim of a crime, there are some things like victim services that kick in, and I think they're better suited to direct people to those resources than I am. In terms of the emotional toll, it's an interesting question. Because that is true. I could definitely remember every single body I've seen. I could remember every single crime scene photo. And I should. Because when you see a photo of 2 dead children, you will never forget it. And that matters so much. That's the burden of this work. But hopefully by sharing that story, you can help somewhat lift the burden from someone else. That's my hope. And having some scars from that, I just consider part of my work. That said, through the years when I've worked with interns on the crime desk, it was always really important to me. I think there's this vision of crime reporters, or reporters in general. It's kind of a historic, probably from people like Jimmy Breslin, like you don't care about nothing and you just do the job. And that's not really true, because if you didn't care, if you couldn't imagine in every case what that would be like if that was your child or someone in your family, then your stories will be empty. They'll have no compassion. They'll have no heart to them. So I've always believed it's okay to be upset. You should be upset. You can't let it interfere with deadline. And you have to be careful about that because you can't let your emotions completely run away with you. I really strongly believe you can't or shouldn't cry at scenes or in court because it scares people, it disturbs people. You're there as a professional, and you sort of need to keep it together. I have cried on my keyboard many times. I've cried in the car more than once, and I think that's okay, and of course I should. And feeling something and being moved by the people whose lives have touched yours, the people who've been willing to share their stories with you, is really, really beautiful. And the other thing I would say is that the reason that I'm often so drawn to these stories is because there is not only terribleness in it. And one of the things that I have found truly amazing about dealing with families after horrible, horrible acts is how resilient people can be, how strong people can be. To see people forgive, move forward, change their whole lives, it is really, truly beautiful. So although some of those images, I pray, are the worst things I will ever see in my life, I have also truly, I think, seen things about the human spirit that I could never have imagined. So it's not only horrible. Yeah. Sorry.
This is working now?
Yep.
Hi. Could you speak to the relatively recent practice by the Edmonton Police of withholding the identification within certain homicide cases?
Yeah, well, I have huge, huge feelings about that, actually. So what this gentleman is asking about is a new policy that we've seen in Edmonton of not only not identifying domestic homicide victims, but in some cases not really identifying that even a domestic homicide has taken place. So instead we'll see something like, 2 people are dead inside of a house, male and female, both in their 40s. That's it. No suspects are being sought. So in fact, we don't even know, is it a double suicide? Is it a carbon monoxide leak? Or is it a murder-suicide? And if it's a murder-suicide, first of all, who's the victim? Who's the killer? And I think one of the things about that policy is because it's being used specifically only in domestic murder-suicides, is it really reinforces this idea of domestic homicide and being a domestic abuse victim as being a shameful thing, which has to be shrouded in secrecy. And I 100% understand why it is so difficult for families to have something that is so internal to your family be made public. But domestic homicide is a absolutely huge, huge concern. The number of women that are killed in this country every year is through the roof, and it's extremely preventable and predictable. And I think the more that we hide it, the more we don't know who these victims are, the more we don't know what happens, the more dangerous it becomes. I have very strong feelings about that. Yes.
Well,
that was what I was going to ask you. Just to follow up, in terms of what we're experiencing here in Edmonton and Calgary, the different rules, what would you do to affect change in that? Because the domestic abuse rates here in Alberta are astounding, as all of Canada. What would you do to kind of change that so we could, be part of that story as well?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's all about awareness and pulling back the veil on it. So suddenly having these cases that we can't even count, they're extremely hard to keep track of. It's very hard. I did a story a couple of years ago trying to look at domestic homicides. Even finding the numbers is extremely difficult. And I would note in that case, on a couple of different occasions, when I talked to family members, they hadn't wanted the name to be private or secret. And of course, families don't all agree, right? There's a lot of people in families that have a lot of different views. So to me, opening up the issue, telling victim stories, just helps to keep getting the information out. And that's a very clear example of where a woman, reading a story and seeing a little bit about her life in the story of a homicide victim can have a very clear impact, and I truly believe can save lives. And so I find it personally very scary to see that sort of shoved under the, blankets again.
We have a question here, and then we'll move to this side, and then we'll move back to this side.
Hi. First of all, thanks for your answers to those questions. I think that, thank you.
Thank you.
And my question is about the title of your talk, The Misery Beat. So, and in your talk you said something along the lines of the role we play as journalists, as true crime journalists, changes over time, and we have to constantly be reimagining and rethinking about the work that we do and why. And given the sort of felt sense of re-interest in true crime on new media platforms, do you see it correlating to the intensification of other forms of misery that are happening in the world right now and are part of the news cycle? So if true crime is not the symptom of a decaying world or not the cause of a decaying world, there are things in the news cycle right now which might be the cause of a decaying world, from climate change to incarceration of children at borders to increasing visibility of police violence, which is another type of misery. So do you think that there's a correlation between the emergence of podcasts, radio shows, Netflix, sort of corporate storytelling, and other forms of misery at this moment in history? Thanks.
Interesting question. I don't think that I particularly do. Now, we're definitely in a period that's uncomfortable and that has change and a lot of scary things happening. I always find it really comforting, actually, to read papers from, history. If you go and browse some papers from 1918, shit didn't look that great then either. So, I do think there's a lot to be gained from keeping things in perspective a little bit. Right now, we have so much media coming at us from all sides. And, of course, news is, by its nature, a lot of it is bad. It's like something that happened, right? I mean, we have political news and some good news stories or whatever, but there's this old expression, we don't write stories about the planes that land. So I think it's easy to feel super overwhelmed by news, and we've seen this throughout history. This isn't even a new thing. When radio came about, when television came about, when the 24-hour news cycle came about, to feel bombarded by bad news all the time, as we now do on social media, we can feel like everything is bad news. It isn't. Well, no, hopefully it isn't. But and I think true crime. When you look back over the past 100 years, it's very consistent interest, and beyond, 150 years especially. It's very consistent that we're drawn to these stories. There's times where there's different kind of aesthetic booms, different stories come into fashion, but I think maybe it's just a constant in our nature. Yeah, I think so. I hope I answered that full question.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is, how do you approach if you really want to tell a story, but like a family member has said no? How do you know? Like you said that you went back and forth with that woman for 2 years. Like, how do you know to keep going with the story? And when do you know, like, I really want to tell this story, but it's like you have to kind of put it to rest?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I ever fully accept that I will not be able to tell a story. There's, and not that I harass people. I think you have to be pretty careful about that. And sometimes people say no and they really mean no, especially at that moment. That may change. So part of it is in the approach, really trying to leave it open for people that maybe, my thinking is if I approach someone fairly and they can see that I'm a person and that I really care and want to tell their story, that even if they say no then, they may think differently about it a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now. These stories go on for lifetimes. So I think in those early dealings, hopefully you can establish a little bit of a rapport. Sometimes, if after an initial conversation someone's like, no, I'm not interested at all, if I've been able to get their email address, or if we're Facebook messaging, or if I have an address where I can leave a note, I will often say, like, I completely understand if you don't want to talk right now. I hope that one day you will consider speaking with me, and, take care. And then sometimes I'll check in, right? Just a little note. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to be, like with Holly, it wasn't a matter of like, are you gonna give me your story now? Like it was, just checking in. How are things going? How's Matt doing? And, she kept hoping I would forget, like I would get bored. But in that process, we got to know each other a bit. And she got to trust me a little bit. And, when I'm talking to someone, if they ask me about myself, I share information with them too, because I think that's only fair. And it's amazing how that rapport can grow over time. So I think just stick with, like, I never accept, I have a few that I haven't been able to get, and I never accept that I won't be able to get them one day. So.
Thank you.
Okay, one final question, and then unfortunately we have to wrap it up.
You mentioned that social media, for example, has changed some of the ethical decisions. If a video that's really graphic is making its rounds on the webs, should outlets publish it? I'm wondering if you can speak to how social media and some other things that have emerged over the course of your career that are different have changed your job as a crime reporter and also some of the ethical decisions that you face.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, in some ways it has completely changed it. But then in other ways, the fundamentals of reporting are still there. And, so there's some things you can get, like this person tweeted about it, and now that's the victim's brother. And like, that was easy. I didn't have to call every single Johnson in the phone book like I used to have to when I started out. But that only gets you so far. And then you have to do the real reporting. I think it also obviously the past few years have seen us really have to change our relationship with the public and rebuild trust in the public. And I think that's a really good thing because, people, they talk about the 80s. Like when I got into journalism, everyone was always like, the 80s were amazing. There was 5,000 people in this newsroom. And I remember someone saying to me once, I used to be able to spend all day writing a 200-word traffic brief. And I'm thinking, like, you should never have spent all day writing a like, that's insane. You had all these resources, you had all these people, and when I look at those papers from the 80s, yeah, they're this thick. There's a lot of crap. There's a lot of filler. There's a lot of syndicated work. There's some really good stuff too, but it's not like those papers were, books of gold, like it's somehow you think they were. And there's a lot of mistakes. And I think at this point when we're really looking at, the public's really thinking about like, what's media and who do I trust and, where am I gonna put my faith? And we cannot make mistakes. We can't make the sloppy mistakes that we used to. Including me. I'm not saying I've never made a mistake. There's a couple of my journalism students here today, and I told them in our class, like, you have to be the best journalists who have ever lived. Like, you do. You have to be so ethical, so smart. You can't make mistakes. You can't be reckless, because on social media, and sadly I see it all the time, a reporter, editor sharing a story that turns out to be fake, a reporter recklessly sharing some information from a scene. I think of mass shooting kind of situations. Of course, it's extremely confusing, it's extremely complicated, and one tweet that has misinformation in it from a reporter can do so much damage. And it's not just to that story and the conception of that story, it's to media, the trust with media, your organization, your byline. So I think in some ways the stakes have never been higher. And that's a good thing, though. Like, that's an amazing thing, because that's one of the things we're seeing right now with all of this amazing true crime work, is like, some of the most sophisticated storytelling and journalism that the world has ever seen. And also that all of these people can access it. Because even in the olden days, when I wrote a story, if someone liked it, they would like cut it out and mail it to their aunt, and she would maybe like put it on the fridge. Now, if you tell a good story, it can be shared around the world, which, by the way, now has the highest literacy rates in the history of humanity, so people can read it and be touched by it and moved by it. So the power of that and the inspiration that we can take from that, to me, is stunning. We just have to not abuse that, because when you make a mistake, it's real shit. Like, it's bad. It's really bad. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. There's far more questions than we have time for, but thank you so much for a provocative talk, and thank you to all of you.